For over 200 years, the United States Coast Guard has executed its mission to enforce federal laws along our coasts, promote national security, improve transportation, commerce, and the national economy, and most importantly, to provide life-saving services for the millions of residents that live along America's coastlines. But how did this great branch of our military first begin? What led to the legacy that the United States Coast Guard has established for over 2 centuries? In this video, we will examine the exciting and profound history of the United States Coast Guard. The origins of the Coast Guard date back to the late 1780s, a few years after the passage of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. As a consequence of the recent war, the new nation was still struggling to pay off war debt, resulting in an event known as the post-war depression. However, by the late 1780s, the economy had begun to improve slightly after the signage of the United States Constitution in 1787, which gave the United States the power to tax. Also, the economy began to recover after the enactment of Hamilton's economic plan under the administration of President George Washington. However, as tensions brewed in far-off France, the United States began to encounter problems involving foreign policy, especially in the latter half of Washington's presidency, stemming into John Adams' presidency shortly thereafter. However, one of the main problems plaguing the United States into the early 1790s was the problem of illegal smuggling of foreign goods along the east coast of the United States. History tells us that this was certainly not a new issue and had occurred for much of the colonial period beginning in the late 1600s. Goods smuggled often included rum, molasses, and sometimes even the smuggling in and trade of African slaves, something that had been banned, suspended, or made more difficult after the Revolutionary War. With so many foreign goods being smuggled, the effect on the new nation's economy was severe. As a result, a bill was proposed in Congress on January 4, 1790, to impose a tariff upon select foreign goods to prevent illegal smuggling, primarily along the east coast of the nation. Alexander Hamilton, who was President Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, was a major proponent of the tariff, as he thought that it would help enforce safety and security from piracy along America's coasts. Hamilton also proposed to the President that the bill allow for the commission of 10 cutters that would patrol the coast to enforce the tariff and to promote safety along the nation's coasts. Washington accepted this idea, and on August 4, 1790, President Washington signed the Tariff Act of 1790, which in turn formed the Revenue Marine Service, composed of the 10 cutters that Alexander Hamilton had originally proposed to the President. This was the first early Coast Guard of the United States. After the formation of the Revenue Marine Service in 1790, it took several years for the Revenue Marine to gain success in enforcing the tariff and other laws along the coasts, especially since the Revenue Marine was the only maritime force of the United States until 1798, when the Navy was reorganized after being disbanded following the Revolutionary War. The first documented incident of the Revenue Marine Service enforcing federal law along American coastlines is represented in this painting dating back to 1793, in which Revenue Marine officials are shown seizing gold that was brought ashore by a French privateer, or essentially a pirate. This painting, among others, is very significant in the history of the United States Revenue Marine because it is one of the first records we have of the execution of one of the primary missions of the modern Coast Guard, to protect our nation's coasts by enforcing federal safety and security laws. The Revenue Marine continued in this role until 1798, when the quasi-war with France began following the XYZ affair. At this point, the technology and importance of the Revenue Marine began to change as the Revenue Marine became involved in wartime. This famous painting of one of the first revenue cutters, the USS Massachusetts, shows what early Revenue Marine vessels would have looked like, and also gives insight on the primitive technology of the Revenue Marine. Most cutters prior to the invention of the steamboat were propelled by sails, as was the case with the Massachusetts. However, as the revenue marine grew and expanded towards the end of the 18th century, the quality and quantity of the vessels gradually increased, especially after an act of Congress was passed in 1799 that allowed the President to commission and maintain the necessary amount of revenue cutters to defend America's coasts. Also, the emergence of the Quasi-War established an important practice that has continued into the era of the modern Coast Guard. During the Quasi-War, the Revenue Marine assisted the newly formed Navy to help maximize maritime armed forces and to improve national defense and security. Once the Quasi-War ended, the Revenue Marine transitioned back to the Department of the Treasury and resorted to its original mission of federal law enforcement and piracy prevention. This is very similar to what happens today in today's modern Coast Guard, in that the Coast Guard remains part of the Department of Homeland Security during peacetime and transitions to the Department of Defense, or the Navy, during wartime. After the Quasi-War with France, the Revenue Marine's role in national security and law enforcement became heightened following the Revolution of 1800 and the consequent election of Thomas Jefferson. Under Jefferson's administration, the Revenue Marine was still required to enforce tariffs and prevent piracy, but national defense also became part of its duties in addition to the Navy due to British ship impressments that would ultimately lead to the War of 1812. Perhaps the most daunting responsibility given to the Revenue Marine during this time period was the enforcement of Jefferson's unpopular and controversial embargo of 1807. Revenue cutters were often assigned to certain ports along the United States East Coast and would ensure that no European goods made it through the ports and into the United States. Also, the revenue cutters were instructed to prevent unauthorized trade ships from exiting the United States waters as a result of the embargo. The Revenue Marine's role in national defense would continue to increase during James Madison's presidency as a result of the impending War of 1812. In the War of 1812, the Revenue Marine fought alongside the Navy, just like it had done during the Quasi-War with France, although this time, the Revenue Marine had grown both quantitatively and technologically since the Quasi-War. In addition, the Navy had very few ships, most sources say between 6 to 10 vessels, and also was devoid of smooth, small, fast-sailing cutters that could capture enemy ships quickly. Thus, the need for the Revenue Marine to assist the Navy was great. For the early part of the war, the revenue cutters proved to be very successful in assisting the Navy as evidenced by the USS Jefferson, which captured the British trade ship the Patriot in the summer of 1812. However, as the war progressed, the powerful British Navy proved no match for the flimsy Revenue Marine and young U.S. Navy. Even through the valor and bravery of the cuttermen, as they came to be called, the British managed to capture several Revenue Marine vessels, including the Surveyor and the Commodore Barry. Even though the Revenue Marine encountered much loss during the War of 1812 helped establish the precedent that the Revenue Marine was willing to exhibit great bravery and valor to defend America's coasts and would not easily surrender or crumple under the pressure of the enemy. In the years succeeding the War of 1812, the Revenue Marine once again resorted to its primordial role of federal law enforcement and piracy prevention. However, it became apparent that the Revenue Marine would also need to incorporate some sort of national security and protection even outside of wartime as the Navy continued to become stronger and more stable. Thus, revenue cutters were also assigned to protect and assist boaters and mariners who needed navigational help or needed assistance. This responsibility would eventually be transferred to the United States Life-Saving Service in the late 1800s and would ultimately become the main mission of the modern Coast Guard in the years preceding World War I. The next major event that influenced the modern Coast Guard would not occur until nearly 5 decades later at the start of the United States Civil War in 1861. The most famous cutter in this conflict was the United States Revenue Cutter, or USRC, Harriet McLane, or simply the Harriet Lane, which is known to have fired the first shots in the Charleston harbor at the beginning of the Civil War in April 1861. As the war progressed, the Harriet Lane and other USRCs were brought under the command of the Navy and assisted in national defense and the execution of naval squadrons and blockades during the remainder of the Civil War. Also, revenue cutters were involved in the transport of troops during the war as well, as evidenced by the voyages of the USRC Miami, which also was used to transport Navy troops to certain areas during the Civil War. The USRC Miami was also famous for transporting President Lincoln himself to certain areas to scout out areas for Union troops or Union ships to abide during the war. Perhaps one of the most famous revenue cutter vessels during the war, besides the McLean and the Miami, was the USRC Naugatuck. Also known as the Ironside, the Naugatuck was instrumental in facilitating the Union blockade during the Civil War and aided in shore bombardments along the Confederate coastlines as well. In the wake of the war, the Ironside would return to the Treasury Department and continue to serve until 1889 before it was sold and decommissioned from the United States Revenue Marine. After the Civil War, the history of the Coast Guard transitions to another preceding agency known as the United States Life-Saving Service, founded in 1872 by President Ulysses S. Grant. The Life-Saving Service had existed informally since the 1840s when the Revenue Marine began to assist mariners along America's shorelines. However, as the need for coastal assistance became greater, it evolved into an official government agency under the direction of the Treasury Department and the Revenue Marine. For just over 4 decades, the U.S. Revenue Marine, that would eventually become known as the Revenue Cutter Service, and the U.S. Life-Saving Service worked interdependently to promote marine assistance and life-saving stations along various ports along the coast of the United States, primarily the East Coast. During wartime, especially during the Spanish-American War, the United States Revenue Cutters and the United States Life-Saving Service role became heightened, and a legacy of search and rescue and national defense was established by these two agencies. By the early 1900s, the two agencies became so intertwined with one another that it was hard to distinguish between the mission of the Revenue Cutter Service and the Life-Saving Service. In addition, a new agency, the U.S. Lighthouse Service, had also been established in 1910 to facilitate coastal safety along major shorelines along both the east and west coast of the United States. However, as World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, it became apparent that maritime forces would need to be maximized in light of unrestricted submarine warfare from German forces. Thus, in January of 1915, President Woodrow Wilson signed into law the act to create the Coast Guard, otherwise known as the Coast Guard Act, which officially merged the United States Revenue Cutter Service with the United States Life-Saving Service to create the modern United States Coast Guard, officially solidifying the old motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. After the creation of the Coast Guard in 1915, the Coast Guard was primarily utilized to enforce America's neutrality policy in World War I. However, after 1917, when the United States finally entered the war, the Coast Guard once again came under the direction of the Navy, and several Coast Guard cutters were deployed overseas to aid in the war, including the Ossipee, Seneca, Yamacraw, Algonquin, and the Manning. These cutters help protect waters and escort marine vessels in areas such as the Strait of Gibraltar near the United Kingdom, Bermuda, and along the coast of Nova Scotia. Also among these cutters was the U.S. Coast Guard cutter, or USCGC Tampa, formerly known as the USRC Miami, the same cutter responsible for the transport of Navy troops during the Civil War. As was the case with most wars that the Coast Guard was involved in, the USCGC Tampa started off well and was successful in escorting several vessels during the war, but would ultimately meet its fate in the fall of 1918 on a mission to Wales after successfully finishing its escort in the Strait of Gibraltar. The ship was believed to be sunk by a German submarine known as the UB-91. According to the United States Coast Guard official history website, it is recorded as the largest loss of life by any U.S. naval vessel in World War I. The Coast Guard would execute similar roles in World War II, starting with the enforcement of FDR's neutrality policies in the years preceding the war. By the spring of 1941, however, the Coast Guard was beginning defense operations in Greenland and along the United States East Coast to help protect the United States from German forces. The USCGC Northland was assigned originally to Greenland for defense missions and was one of the first vessels sent to an Arctic region. This is what would establish the Coast Guard's polar icebreaker network after the war. The Northland was also famous for capturing the Norwegian ship Busko, the first captured vessel made by American forces in World War II. By the fall of 1941, just a few months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Coast Guard was brought under the command of the Navy and continued in Arctic defense operations, sinkage of German submarines, naval escorts, security at ports along America's coasts, and life-saving services such as search and rescue. During the early part of the war, the primary mission of the Coast Guard was to sink German U-boats and submarines that were concentrated across the Atlantic. Also, port security was of critical importance, and many cutters patrolled coastal areas such as beaches and docks. During the latter part of the war, the Coast Guard's main mission transitioned to search and rescue as a result of torpedo attacks made along the coast of the United States and over the Atlantic. The Coast Guard would also promote search and rescue operations in Normandy as well for the latter part of the war.
The next major war that the Coast Guard would be a part of would be the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s. Since the Vietnam War was not a declared war, the Coast Guard did not officially come under the direction of the Navy during this time, but rather performed several duties and assisted several military branches including the Navy, Army, and the Air Force. The Coast Guard's chief duties during this war included harbor protection of South Vietnam, inshore patrols, and assisting in naval enemy attacks along the coast of Vietnam. In the latter half of the war, the Coast Guard started protecting deep water ports as well. The Vietnam War earned several U.S. CGCs many medals and achievements and re-established the Coast Guard's legacy of not backing down in the presence of enemy forces. The Coast Guard would continue to serve in more recent conflicts and wars such as Desert Storm in the late 80s into the 90s, and also would serve to protect the nation's coasts in the aftermath of 9/11 in 2001. Today, the United States Coast Guard is an agency of the Department of Homeland Security, whose primary role is national security and search and rescue. Although the Coast Guard has undergone many structural and technological advancements since its founding in the late 1700s, its mission to remain always ready to defend the nation's coasts, enforce federal laws along our coasts, promote search and rescue missions along the U.S. coast, has stood strong well into the 21st century, and will certainly continue for many years to come.